October the 21st, 1805. Off the Cape of Trafalgar in the unforgiving North Atlantic, British warships are locked in a savage battle with a combined French and Spanish fleet. It was to prove a crushing British victory, but the price would be the death of the Royal Navy's most celebrated commander, Horatio Nelson.
Nelson had a huge sense of destiny. He had this sense that he was going to die a hero. He was going to die a hero in his greatest victory.
The victory ensured Britain's supremacy at sea for more than a century. But things could have been very different. Was Napoleon's Franco-Spanish fleet closer to victory at Trafalgar than historians have previously claimed?
It was a very close-run thing. The French and the Spanish fought with far greater gallantry, far more determination than the British had expected.
Now, new technology and groundbreaking historical detective work are shedding crucial new light on the Battle of Trafalgar and the qualities of a man remembered as the greatest naval leader in history. Just how much did Nelson risk at the Battle of Trafalgar? In 1805, Europe had been engulfed in war for nearly a decade. Napoleon dominated mainland Europe and was poised to invade his most bitter enemy, Britain. But crossing the English Channel, French troopships would be vulnerable to attack from British warships. And so Napoleon combined the French fleet with that of Allied Spain in order to protect the invasion force. Knowing that destruction of this combined fleet was the key to averting invasion, Nelson and other British admirals pursued and blockaded the French and Spanish, trying desperately to bring them to a decisive battle. By October 1805, after nearly 2 years at sea, Nelson had the combined fleet cornered at Cadiz, near Gibraltar.
Other admirals instituted close blockades, so they would almost literally block the French fleet up in harbour. Nelson took the exact contrary view, and he instituted loose blockade, whereby he was encouraging the French to come out, and he would then be able to bring them to battle and defeat them.
The events surrounding the resultant battle have become legendary. Nelson conceived an elaborate, daring new plan of attack and carefully orchestrated the battle. The boldness of the plan and Nelson's charismatic leadership ensured the defeat of Napoleon's combined fleet. Because it was such a resounding victory, Trafalgar is often regarded as a foregone conclusion. But the latest research is showing that Britain's most famous naval triumph was anything but inevitable. In the long months of blockade that preceded Trafalgar, Nelson had come under severe political pressure. The British government desperately needed a victory.
Clearly, Nelson wanted a major battle of annihilation. He recognized that there needed to be a victory to help buoy up the coalition, because it was quite likely Napoleon would do quite well on land. He had a habit of doing that. Therefore, the British had to demonstrate as dramatically as possible that they were dominant at sea. And no matter how many times Napoleon might win on land, he couldn't win the war.
But most large-scale naval actions at this time were anything but decisive.
The traditional form of naval battle was both sides to form in a single line, and 2 lines to come up against each other like that and fire at each other. Now, the problem with that type of battle was usually it was very indecisive. It might last for perhaps even several days in some cases, with neither side actually winning a victory. Nelson's idea was to develop a battle that would ensure a victory.
Instead of the usual linear approach, Nelson decided to attack head-on with his ships in columns to break the line of the French and Spanish fleet and provoke a decisive close-quarter battle. But there was a drawback to this tactic.
To actually sail into an enemy line meant you were vulnerable to all the ships in the line as you came in. So it was a calculated risk. But Nelson knew that if you did manage to penetrate an enemy line with the wind behind you, the enemy would have great difficulties getting away, and that you could bring on what he always called a pell-mell battle. It was, in many respects, a very reckless gamble.
Historians have always believed that such a radical approach must have been carefully prepared before the battle. Until recently, there was only anecdotal evidence for this, including accounts of Nelson explaining his plan to colleagues and friends throughout 1805. But at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, a major new clue has been found. Colin White was conducting routine research into the 5,000 or so documents in the Nelson papers when he made an amazing discovery.
I came across a list of names on a fairly small piece of paper. It was a list of favours that he wanted to get for protégés of his. And then, as one is always taught to do, I turned it over.
On the back was a small pen and ink sketch, strikingly similar to the layout of the Battle of Trafalgar. It showed a single line representing an enemy fleet, with Nelson's fleet in 3 divisions breaking through at right angles. Far from a highly elaborate and detailed plan, the diagram is little more than a brief sketch. But Colin believes it also holds a vital clue as to Nelson's state of mind as he prepared for the battle.
This is the excitement of this particular diagram. This is not a carefully drawn battle plan with "this is my plan for the Battle of Trafalgar" on it. This is a very quick thumbnail sketch done to accompany a conversation. And in fact, right in the centre there, you can see that he's got so excited in saying that he's going to drive through the line that he dug into the page and the ink has blotted.
The emphatic gesture suggests Nelson's desperation to finally defeat the combined fleet at sea, even if it meant acting impulsively with only the barest notion of a plan. It was a considerable gamble, and Nelson's flamboyant, maverick character was crucial to the plan.
Nelson had an immense ego, but he moderated that by a great dash of humanity. He was quite clearly loved by many people, and not just Lady Hamilton. He was a very popular commander, and he had a charisma which the men could easily see, and therefore he was able to get from his men and from his fleets a performance which perhaps no other officer could.
Always leading from the front, Nelson was no stranger to extreme personal danger. He'd been wounded several times in previous battles, losing his right arm at Tenerife. But the British would need more than their admiral's legendary charisma, for they were about to fight the most technologically advanced and powerful fleet in the world. By October 1805, the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson is blockading Napoleon's combined French and Spanish fleet at Cadiz in southwestern Spain. In command of the combined fleet was the French Admiral Pierre Villeneuve. He was under pressure from Napoleon. If the British Navy was not defeated before winter, his planned invasion of Britain would have to be abandoned. Time was running out. So though there were signs the weather was about to worsen, Villeneuve ordered his fleet to sea.
Here we are, dawn, October 21st, 1805, a date that will forever after live in the history of the Royal Navy. I'm standing just behind the British fleet, 27 ships of the line, the largest ones with 100 guns, the smallest with 64. And ahead of them, lit by the Iberian sunrise coming up in the east behind me, is what they've been waiting for and looking for. The Franco-Spanish fleet, 33 ships of the line, stretching really from one side of the horizon to the other. It looks like a formidable array of fighting power, but to Nelson, it's a target, inviting destruction.
The target included some of the most technologically advanced ships in the world. The French Navy in particular had conducted extensive research into hydrodynamics and ship design.
In the last century or so, from about 1730, the French had a reputation for building very good ships. The French ships tended to have finer lines underwater. They were slightly faster in good weather conditions. And the reason was that the French would stay in port till they saw an opportunity. They would then come out and they'd make a quick dash for wherever they were trying to go.
The Spanish, too, were well equipped with powerful ships, designed to protect convoys to their South American colonies.
Regarding the ship of the Spanish fleet, they made superb, well-designed ships, combining the gunnery power and the sailing facilities. It was a long research for decades to find out the middle way between a good machine for the combat and at the same time a good machine for the winds and the storms.
As well as superior design qualities, the combined fleet had another advantage over the British.
By Trafalgar, the British had 27 ships of the line. These were the big fighting ships, the equivalent of battleships perhaps in the 20th century. And the French and Spanish combined had 33. So they had really, technically, they had a substantially stronger fleet.
Was Nelson overconfident in taking on such a powerful force? What was it about the British Navy that Nelson had so much trust in? HMS Unicorn is the oldest British-built warship still afloat. Most of the remaining ships from this era have been completely restored by modern craftsmen. But miraculously, Unicorn has survived intact. Although she was built after the Napoleonic Wars, her design principles are identical to many of Nelson's ships at Trafalgar. Maritime archaeologists Robert Prescott and Dan Atkinson are experts on wooden-built sailing vessels. They're conducting a painstaking study of Unicorn to discover more about shipbuilding in the British Navy of Nelson's time. All over the ship are unique details of the lost art of wooden ship construction, from aspects of overall design to individual methods of timber jointing. But the evidence Robert and Dan are most interested in lies in the strange rune-like carvings embedded in the ship's beams and planking. These are the Shipwrights marks, evidence of the individual craftsmen who built Nelson's navy.
The timber marks actually are a lovely indication of a sort of secret language within the dockyard, where the marks are actually understood within the working processes of the yard between the shipwrights and the officers who are superintending the works that are happening in the yard. And this is where it really starts happening, isn't it? Well, it's really the beams that we've been concentrating on, isn't it?
Their research has led Dan and Robert to believe that this secret language was evolving rapidly in Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. Nowhere more so than the place where Unicorn herself was built, the Royal Dockyard at Chatham in Kent. The largest of all the British shipyards, Chatham produced many of the ships in Nelson's fleet at Trafalgar, including his flagship, HMS Victory. An extraordinary discovery here ties in with Robert and Dan's research on board Unicorn. During recent restoration work, a number of massive timber beams were found preserved beneath a 200-year-old floor. More than 160 specimens were eventually recovered. They were identified as the framework of an early 19th century warship. It's a mystery why this particular ship was preserved disassembled in this way. But one advantage of this is that Shipwrights marks, similar to those on Unicorn, are more exposed.
This has this nice race mark here. This is carved by a shipwright using a race tool or a race knife. You see it's got a series of Roman numerals here. This is all part of the business of helping other shipwrights to understand where this is destined to go. They communicate with each other using these markings which they leave all over the place.
These race marks would have enabled shipwrights to quickly reassemble the vessel like a prefabricated kit.
We're beginning to see a measure of standardization here, and people are very careful to mark their work so that when it's sent from the carpenter's shop down to the ways where the shipwrights assemble the ship, everybody knows where it's going. This is the starboard hand end of the beam, and it's beam number 23, so that's the station mark along the length of the ship. But perhaps the most remarkable thing is down here, where you have die-stamped initials that have been struck in the end of the timber with a metal die. And we find this in a number of pieces throughout here. We have a series of sets of initials. There's a very sophisticated system of timber management emerging here, which enables the shipwrights in different parts of the yard to communicate with each other and understand exactly what's required of them.
This growing standardization meant that at the time of Trafalgar, the British Navy's shipbuilding and maintenance was becoming increasingly efficient. After months, even years at sea, British blockade ships could be effectively maintained by highly versatile dockyards. What the British fleet's warships lacked in size and speed, they made up for by being more practical and better maintained than those of their French and Spanish enemies. But there were more French and Spanish ships, and so they had more guns than the British. Nelson knew that his best chance was to create chaos, the pell-mell battle he'd been planning for months. The British fleet would have to sail directly into the enemy guns.
On the day of the battle itself, everyone in the British fleet knows that the battle is in the offing, because they know that the enemy fleet is out, and they know that their admiral is going to go after it. And so the ships are then signalled to get into two lines. He decides to go with two lines. There's an enormous sense of speed in this, because he wants to get the enemy as off balance as possible.
Nelson lacked sufficient ships for the 3 lines as he'd originally planned. Attacking regardless with only 2 made his tactics even riskier. Around midday, the attacking British ships are forming 2 ragged columns as they begin the long, exposed charge into the Franco-Spanish line.
Here we are, the British attack has begun. The 2 lines are formed. Nelson's line here, led by Victory. Collingwood's line here, led by Royal Sovereign. The other ships behind, more or less in formation. The plan now is to strike through the enemy line, get on the other side, where it's hard for the enemy to escape, and bring on what Nelson always called a pell-mell action.
The radical new battle tactic put not only Nelson's ships at enormous risk, but also his own personal safety.
There was a great deal of jostling for the head of the columns. Collingwood was leading his column, and Nelson was leading his. And the ships astern of Nelson, particularly HMS Temeraire, was trying to get past. And there's a famous moment where the Temeraire looked as if she was about to overtake the Victory, and Nelson comes out onto the deck and shouts at the captain, "I'll thank you, Captain Harvey, to keep your proper station, which is astern of the Victory." So there's that almost sense of excitement and jockeying going on, like knights riding in a cavalry charge.
The head-on charge meant the British ship's sails would be fully exposed, square on to the combined fleet. This played straight into the hands of the French and Spanish gunners.
What the French and Spanish are trying to do, the French in particular, I think, is to go for the enemy's sails, go for the rigging. So they try and dismast the ships. This is what we would now call a mobility kill.
As the British advanced, the flagship Victory and the other lead ships were defenseless, their own guns unable to bear on their enemy. What's more, the weather was changing and unusually calm winds made it agonizingly slow, no more than walking pace. Just how much of a risk was this? One way to find out is to establish how much cannon fire the Victory and Nelson were exposed to. To find out, Robert Prescott is making a study of the last surviving, truly original part of Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory. More than 50 feet wide, this sail would have been the main aiming point for the combined fleet gunners as Victory approached. It's a unique relic and still bears the battle scars of Trafalgar. Robert will conduct a survey of the damage in order to quantify how much and what types of enemy fire Victory sustained.
Taking this hull, for example.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, isn't it?
It's sort of got two straight lines, and yet the rest of it is pretty much curved. Have we got any ideas on that?
Well, one thing we have to be aware of is that the combined fleet will have been using a number of different projectiles.
Yes.
It'll be using round shot, and we would hope that one sees a fairly discreet puncturing of the sail with that. But they were also using chain shot and bar shot.
But some of the holes in the sail look distinctly odd. They're nothing like depictions of cannon-damaged sails in period paintings. It's possible that some of this damage may have been caused after the battle by souvenir hunters.
In a way, this looks very much as if it might be one of those, because that looks like a very straight cut edge. There's no fraying of the margins at all. I mean, a well-sharpened seaman's knife might well have done that.
Robert will first have to try and establish how much of the damage is original from the battle. The only way to do that is to inflict some damage of his own. On board the Victory, Nelson is racing headlong into the attack on the French and Spanish combined fleet. He's outnumbered and outgunned. How can we discover just how much of a risk Nelson was running? Robert Prescott wants to find out how much of the damage on Victory's foretopsail was caused by enemy cannon fire. This will enable him to assess how much fire Nelson exposed himself to. He's commissioned a sample sail made from flax canvas, exactly the same as Victory's foretopsail.
And although this is a really very small sail by the standards of the foretopsail, it is made in exactly the same way, made of the standard cloths, 2 foot in width, seamed up with a nice double seam here, and suspended by row bands from a spar. It's looking very good just now. Quite pleased with the way that's setting.
To reconstruct the kind of damage incurred at Trafalgar, Robert enlists the aid of cannon expert Colonel Simon West. French and Spanish gunners used various types of ammunition against enemy ships. The most basic was solid iron round shot.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. That is actually very interesting from our point of view, because you can see the impact of the ball, but you can also see this tearing, right?
It's fascinating.
Horizontal and vertical tearing. There's an awful lot of that sort of damage on the sail.
That on its own isn't a very effective shot, is it? I mean, from my point of view, you're not seeing something that's stopping the function of the piece of equipment.
round shot would be effective in a lucky hit on a ship's mast. But other types of projectile were more suited against canvas and rope. Bar shot was designed to spin in flight, slicing through a wider area than round shot.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
But in this case, the range is too short for the bar shot to begin to spin, so it creates less destruction than expected.
From the look of the hull, it looks like a similar rip to the ones we had before. That said, if it hit something hard, like a mast, it would probably then immediately start spinning, and obviously there's lots more rigging in and amongst it, so it may just need that first impact to get it spinning and then rip through other material around.
A development on bar shot was the deadliest of all the projectiles the French and Spanish used. Chain shot.
Now the chain shot is simply two projectiles chained together, and this would have been left in on casting. They travel up the bore together, and as soon as they come out of the muzzle, they separate and will be immediately unstable and start spinning.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
But you can see that the chain's fully extended at this point.
In fact, you can even see marks from
the chain. Yes, yes.
In fact, the chain, you can see the chain has ripped.
Yes, that's
all
right,
the way down.
yeah.
So it's
like a cheese wire.
It wouldn't take many shots like that to reduce the power the sail is transmitting to the boat.
First one is the top hole there, the top smudge.
The top smudge. So that's number 3 there.
Back at their base in Chatham, Robert and Dan record and analyze the damage on the sample sail. Each type of projectile has produced a different damage signature, which Robert compares with foretopsail damage.
Yeah, we have to do that, that's true. And many of those odd shapes, which people perhaps in the past have thought were not related to shot damage on Victory's foretopsail, I suspect are now, because one of the things that's so striking is the way the impact of the round shot in particular tears the warp and the weft of the sail and produces a lot of triangular shapes, very much the same as the ones we see on the Victory foretopsail.
Straight edges.
Yeah. Now that we know the kind of damage that we were able to produce in the experiment, if we go back to the foretopsail and we look at the damage which that has suffered, I think we can clearly identify those parts which are battle-related and those which are not. And in my view, it is very much the case that a good deal of that is battle-related and not souvenir-taking at all, much more battle damage to that sail than perhaps we had previously accepted.
The test has confirmed documentary accounts of the huge amount of firepower Victory sustained in the battle. If a single gun can inflict this amount of damage with only a few shots, Nelson and Victory were at huge risk from hundreds of French and Spanish cannons firing unopposed for 20 minutes. At around 30 minutes after noon, Victory smashed through the French and Spanish line.
Here we are, the point of contact. Up here, Collingwood ships are already engaged in their melee at the back end of the Franco-Spanish line. But here is Nelson's flagship. He's moving through the line with the enemy flagship on his left. As he passes in Victory, her guns, double, triple-shotted perhaps, fire a raking broadside right through the French flagship that causes horrendous casualties as these cannonballs bounce their way down through the French ship.
Despite the huge risk, Nelson had succeeded in bringing on a pell-mell battle, and the French and Spanish had failed to stop the British attack. Now, as the two fleets came to close action, everything would depend on the fighting prowess of individual crews. But for months leading up to Trafalgar, the combined fleet had been trapped at the Spanish port of Cadiz. Many crews were confined to their ships in the harbour. But in the old city, it's still possible to see the cramped tenements where many French and Spanish seamen were quartered in squalid conditions.
The streets here in Cadiz, of course, were full of sailors at the time. There were cafes just like now, drinking spots, and other spots where sailors like to congregate, chasing the women and all the rest of it. It was quite an intrusion, and you had them by the thousands.
Maritime historian René Chartrand believes this long confinement in harbour had serious consequences for both French and Spanish crews.
The training regime would have been minimal because of the possibilities of this place. You can't really fire powder and ball here, and so the training regime will tend to be going up and down the mast and so on, but otherwise very minimal. Of course, you get eventually half-trained crews.
But for the French Navy in particular, Cadiz was merely the last in a long line of catastrophes dating back to before the war with Britain. Only 20 years before Trafalgar, the French Navy had been at the height of its power. But everything changed in 1789 with the French Revolution.
The French officer corps was literally guillotined, and those that weren't left the country. There was tremendous technical neglect. The ships were left to basically rot in the harbors. A fleet is a very, very complicated thing, and it's a very technical thing that you don't neglect for 10 years. And of course, that's what they'd done. They neglected the fleet to an almost irreparable state.
But what of the other half of the combined fleet? The Spanish had no shortage of officers, and they were at least as well trained as officers in the British Navy, aided by the renowned academy at San Fernando. Why then were the Spanish ships of the combined fleet not more effective against the British?
We know that crewing of the Spanish ships in particular had been a problem. We know, for example, that some of the larger ships simply had, instead of sailors, they had army conscripts on board, firing the guns and so on.
But what could have caused the Spanish Navy's chronic manpower shortage? It was whilst researching Spanish climatological records for Trafalgar that meteorologist Dennis Wheeler made a chance discovery. Yellow fever.
This is a report published in Gibraltar on epidemic diseases, but in particular on yellow fever, contagious fevers in general. Fortunately for us, published in 1806. So this will have an account of the events of 1804 and indeed previous years to that, when yellow fever would have been sweeping through Andalusia.
Cadiz was badly affected by this epidemic, but just how crucial it was to the outcome of the Battle of Trafalgar only became clear when Dennis Wheeler met local historian Dr. Sam Bernardi.
And there's been passing references to outbreaks of yellow fever and similar diseases in the early 19th century. Is there any evidence from the statistics you've got to hand to suggest that there might have been a particular influence on people in military service at the time?
Well, it was curious that of, I think it was something like 2,800 deaths reported in Cadiz in 1804, only 200 were women, which suggests to me that the epidemic it might have, if these figures are right, might have occurred in some sort of barracks area where there were only men.
In Cadiz, before Trafalgar, thousands of Frenchmen and Spaniards were still recovering from this epidemic. Nearly 3,000 had already died. Though Nelson could not have known it, the combined fleet was nowhere near full strength or efficiency. 30 minutes in, and the battle has become a series of savage individual duels between ships. The British are gaining the upper hand, but Nelson himself faces a stern challenge.
coming up here is the important vessel, the French counterattack, Captain Lucas's Red Utab, the best-handled ship in the fleet. These two ships clash together. It's the closest of close actions, the signal which is still flying until it gets shot away from the masts of victory. But Captain Lucas of Red Utab has his masts festooned with musketeers. They are going to make life quite literally impossible on the upper deck of victory, and Nelson's personal fate is about to be decided.
The extraordinary French captain Jean-Jacques Lucas of the Red Utab was in a class apart.
Lucas was one of the few French captains who'd actually thought about the battle in advance. And so, ironically, the victory comes up against the one ship that can really deal her a serious blow.
Lucas' battle plan was to engage as close as he could, and, if possible, board the largest possible ship that he could lay his hand on. And he had trained his men for this, trained them to hope for this, and by George, it happened.
While blockaded in Cadiz, Captain Lucas had trained his men ceaselessly till they were experts in boarding and musketry. But he had also trained them in the use of a far more devastating weapon. He knew that these primitive, hand-thrown grenades would prove highly effective at close quarters.
As the victory comes alongside and gets locked together with her, the Red Utab shuts all her lower gun ports. The men from the lower gun ports are brought up onto the upper deck. There are men in the rigging as well, and they concentrate on firing on the Victory's upper deck.
Now, there was Lucas' ship, which was a 74, a smaller ship than the Victory, certainly, but that didn't matter to him, because once they got in close to the Victory, within a few minutes, the decks of the Victory were practically emptied of men.
He'd survived the French and Spanish cannon fire, but faced with this furious close-range assault, Nelson was again in deadly peril.
Virtually nothing could live on the upper deck of Victory. The hail of fire that French ship had brought to bear was such that nothing could live there. It either had to take refuge or it died.
By 1 p.m., Red Utab's crew had turned Victory's upper deck into a smouldering ruin. And right in the midst of this chaos, in full view of the enemy, Nelson still paces the quarterdeck. He's dangerously, almost suicidally exposed.
There is a traditional view, almost a legend, of the death of Nelson, that there he is, slightly vain, covered in his orders and so on, an absolutely sitting duck.
Suddenly, as Nelson and his second-in-command turn, Nelson falls, struck by a single bullet. Though he's still conscious, it's clear to all around that their charismatic admiral is dying. Legend has it that one of Lucas' sharpshooters was able to identify Nelson because of the sparkling orders on his jacket. But how much of this legend is true?
If you look at Nelson's uniform in the National Maritime Museum, it's his rather threadbare working rig. Of course he had his orders on it, but they were embroidered, they weren't shining.
If he were not so visible as previously thought, could Nelson have been singled out by a French marksman, the way the legend suggests? By 2 p.m., the Battle of Trafalgar is swinging in favor of the British fleet. But Britain's Admiral Horatio Nelson, who had led the British attack, lies dying. Is it possible that his reckless plan for the battle has led directly to his own death?
In trying to understand how Nelson came to be shot, one needs to think oneself into the situation on the quarterdeck of the Victory on the 21st of October 1805. The Victory's upper deck is being swept by a swathe of bullets from all different positions and places.
At the scene of the shooting, the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, now moored in the English port of Portsmouth, a team of experts has assembled. They'll try to establish whether Nelson was killed by a deliberately aimed marksman's shot or simply by chance in the chaos of battle.
So far as we know, Hardy and Nelson were pacing down the middle of the deck here. Nelson on the right, Hardy on the left. The custom would be to pace together and to turn inwards so you could continue the conversation and then go back down this way. These guns are all firing. You've got a ship over there firing at you. You've got all the rigging in the way. So there's a huge amount of baffle. Yet this chap is supposed to be able to accurately spot that it's the Admiral and hit him from a distance of 40 yards when he's moving. I just find it difficult to believe that it was deliberately aimed.
Allowing for battle conditions, could it have been possible for a marksman to pick Nelson out individually on the quarterdeck? The team bring in period firearms expert Ivan Williams. He'll use exactly the same kind of smoothbore musket as used by Lucas's men on the Red Utab. But instead of musket balls, Ivan will use the latest Swedish military technology to measure his accuracy. The musket has been fitted with a small arms transmitter, or SAT. It's a weapon effect simulator, as used in training by the British Army. On the range with live rounds, Ivan ensures the musket's lethal accuracy. He and combat simulator expert Martin Ernesson then zero in the SAT. Triggered by a blank round, the SAT fires a laser representing the path of the bullet. If Ivan's on target, the receiver vest indicates a hit. From Nelson's position when he was hit and the detail on the wound, the team first attempt to establish what direction the bullet came from.
So if we're going through the back of that vertebra and we know that it's fairly close to the shoulder tip, if his shoulder was hunched forward a little bit more, we're looking at an angle that is perhaps shallower than people imagine.
Well, fascinatingly, you are pointing straight up at where the mizzen top would have been, in my opinion.
This matches exactly with surviving eyewitness accounts, which describe where the shot came from. Ivan will shoot from the approximate position of Red Utab's mizzen top, 20 meters above Victory's quarterdeck.
Killed. Killed. Wounded. Right arm. Killed.
9 out of 10 shots are on target, 7 of them fatal. Do the team believe Nelson could have been deliberately shot?
Having seen our friend walk through in the manner he did, and he was killed twice out of twice, my view is that I reckon that it was an aimed shot.
I am definitely not convinced, even though he got those kills, that it was on the day an aimed shot. I still think that there was just so much fire being aimed on this spot that he was going to get shot anyway.
The adrenaline up there would be considerable, however calm and used to it they were. And you have to say that it could have been an aim shot. You can, like Thomas Plunkett in the Rifles, you can never say it can't.
The weight of evidence suggests it's highly likely Nelson was felled by a deliberately aimed shot. Even without the conspicuous orders on his uniform, he was still extremely vulnerable. Given that Red Utab's men had already killed or wounded more than 50 of Victory's crew on the exposed deck, Nelson was lucky to have survived as long as he did.
Now the battle is over, and here we have the chaos of a pell-mell action, a melee. The ships are all over the place, the ordered lines have gone. But note, every Franco-Spanish ship has a British ship alongside. This is a great and glorious victory. 18 ships of the line are now captured by the British. This is one of the greatest victories in naval history.
But hundreds of sailors, French, English and Spanish, lay dead on battered ships. Survivors felt themselves lucky to be alive. But for many, the ordeal was only beginning.
While the battle's being fought, the seas are getting higher. Nelson knows there's a storm coming in off the open Atlantic. Therefore, he leaves strict orders that after the battle, the fleet should go to anchor to weather this storm.
This was difficult enough for the British, but most of the combined fleet ships they had captured as prizes were severely battle damaged. It was no way to face a storm.
To be anchored, to be secure, night time's coming, a storm's on its way, is really all you could hope for in terms of security. They weren't able to do it. They didn't have the anchors, they didn't have the cables. In some cases, they didn't have the manpower.
Nelson had chosen to fight the battle, knowing it was a race against the weather. Once again, he had run a terrible risk. Even though the British fleet had won a victory, the survivors were now horribly exposed to a nightmarish storm. If the British fleet were lost, the victory would count for nothing. All but 4 of the 18 captured ships sank. More than 2,000 men who had survived the battle were lost at sea.
On the 22nd of October, the people in Cadiz saw a very horrible landscape. On the beaches, they saw corpses, mast, rigging, waste of the combined fleet.
Nelson won a crushing victory at Trafalgar, but had risked everything to achieve it. With a hazardous and impulsive plan, Nelson steered his fleet directly into a storm of fire. Fortunately for the British fleet, which had already secured victory, Nelson's death came too late to affect the final outcome of the battle. But his gamble with the weather was the greatest risk of all, and could have led to the loss of the British fleet itself. Nelson's place in history was assured. At a price of more than 5,000 Spanish, French, and British lives. They lie still in the treacherous dark waters off Cape Trafalgar.